Well, good morning, everyone, again. My name is Luke, and it is really an honour and a privilege to be with you all this morning. I want to thank you all for inviting me out to your church community to speak to you this morning. And as we've heard, we're starting a new series here at CityReach West entitled God Questions. This is a series investigating some difficult questions relating to God and Christianity. And to kick it off, we are going to be addressing the big question of God and science. And you know, we live in a world today where scientism is on the rise. What that means is that such power and confidence is placed in scientific knowledge and techniques that secular science is fast establishing itself as the most authoritative worldview in the Western world, right? And especially in universities, the places where the next generation of powerful and influential people are being developed, science is held up on the highest of pedestals. And in addition to this, many such people, they view belief in God and Christianity as primitive beliefs, outdated, and certainly not belonging in the public sphere where knowledge and progress are sought. And so what this means is that there's this often perceived gigantic chasm existing between science and religion, or science and faith. Right, so that belief in God is fine if you keep that bottled up and isolated in your private life, but when it actually comes to finding knowledge and developing society, well, religion should just be left out of the picture. And for me, this has been a topic I've been deeply interested in and have investigated for a long while because, like I said, I've always loved science and have studied it for a while, but I've also grown up with a Christian faith. And so for me, the question has been, can I keep these two areas of my life separate and completely disconnected? And I found the answer to that question very quickly was no. Right, I wanted to have a logically coherent and complete worldview, and splitting it up into different isolated segments was never going to be intellectually satisfying. So then the question became, is it really true that these two things, faith and science, are incompatible? Do I really have to choose between the two? Has science disproven the existence of God and Christianity? And what I've actually realized is that secular science, right, science without God, it actually has some fundamental limitations and assumptions that actually mean it can never disprove the existence of God and Christianity. But then in addition to that, I've also come to realize that belief in God and Christianity are remarkably logical and are actually far better at grounding science and providing a basis for science than other worldviews. That secular science is actually inconsistent with itself and incomplete at providing an explanation for the universe. And so hopefully this is what we're going to uncover this morning, both that secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity, but also that secular science is actually inferior to belief in God and Christianity. Now today, in the very short time we've got, we can really only scratch the surface of what can be said on this massive topic. And so we're going to try and keep things really broad and not get bogged down in any particular scientific field. But if you do have more specific questions about anything to do with science, then we are going to have a short time for Q&A afterwards. So in a sec, a phone number will come up on the screen. And if anything pops into your head during this talk, feel free to text in a question to that phone number and we can address those later. So let's begin by looking at why secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity. Okay, first of all, secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity because it's limited. See, whenever we come to talk about science, there's actually a really important distinction that we need to make because there are actually two different types of science. Right? On the one hand, we have what we call operational science. This type of science is all about repeatable experiments and observations that can be made in the present, in the here and now. You know, you conduct an experiment and then you observe what happens. And you can repeat that same experiment time and time again and always observe the same results. So this type of science is about things taking place right before our eyes. And it's actually this type of science that has produced the amazing technology we enjoy in our world today. like mobile phones and satellites and airplanes. It's operational science that produces amazing medical breakthroughs, right? This type of science has done amazing things for our world. But the other type of science is what we call historical science. So sciences like cosmology, paleontology, evolutionary biology, and then much of my field, geology. And you'll probably notice straight away that it's these fields of science that seem to be the ones that are constantly attacking God and Christianity, right? I mean, you might have heard statements like, God doesn't exist because cosmology has shown the Big Bang explains the universe. Or the Bible is clearly wrong because evolutionary biology has shown that evolution produced life on Earth. It wasn't created like the Bible says. And so you generally don't hear attacks on God and Christianity coming from fields of operational science like meteorology and computer science, right? So what is historical science and how does it differ from operational science? Well, historical sciences are all concerned with events that took place in the past, hence the title historical. And what that means is that these sciences are all fundamentally limited because we have no access to the past to study those events. Right? So just imagine a scientist who finds a fossil. He makes observations about that fossil in the present. He might observe how big it is, how many vertebrae it has, how well the skeleton is preserved. And that's good operational science, right? Those observations can all be repeated. But he then uses those observations to piece together a subjective interpretation of the past. So maybe how that animal once lived and what it ate and how long ago it died. That's historical science. And these interpretations, they're not those solid scientific facts like we get from operational science. They're subjective stories. And what that means is they can often turn out to be wrong. So, for example, in the early 1900s, there was this guy by the name of Harold Cook. He was an American rancher and geologist, and he discovered a tooth in a creek bed in Nebraska. And with the help of some other scientists, they identified this tooth as coming from an extinct species of ape, more closely related to humans than other apes. And this finding, it was published in the prestigious journal Science and was heralded as the missing link between apes and humans. But then a few years later, the rest of the skeleton that this tooth came from was discovered. And it turns out those scientists made a massive mistake. It turns out the tooth came from neither ape nor human, but rather from a pig. Right? This highlights the limitations of historical science. I mean, can you guys see how a statement like, this tooth must have come from this ape, which must have been the ancestor of humans, can you see that's a subjective statement about an inaccessible event in the past? To put it another way, right, I used to love watching the crime show CSI. So as new evidence was uncovered for a certain crime, I used to love trying to figure out who had done it. Was it the crazy friend? Was it the jealous workmate? Or was it the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend? And it was always the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend, right? Every time. So historical science is a lot like the crime show CSI. The forensic science on that show is all about making observations on clues in the present to piece together an event in the past, the crime scene at the time of the murder. But that crime scene at that time, it's not accessible to interrogation and observation by science. Because that event is over, it's gone, it's never again to be repeated. And so the crime scene that's pieced together by the detectives, it's always subjective. And that's why the suspect is never just convicted on the basis of forensic evidence. Normally on the show, the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend is backed into a corner in an interrogation room and confesses through tears and smudged eye makeup, right? But in real life, if that confession doesn't happen, the suspect has to go to court, where all the evidence is laid out. And the prosecution lawyers present their interpretation of the evidence, and then the defense lawyers present their interpretation of the evidence. So you can see we have two different subjective interpretations of the one set of evidence, the one set of facts, the one set of data. The claims of historical science are like this. They're fundamentally subjective. And so what that means is that historical science, right, this science that seems so opposed to God and Christianity, it's actually limited. It cannot with confidence prove subjective historical events that conflict with the Christian worldview, nor can it disprove historical events held in the Christian worldview. Right? Secular science cannot disprove the existence of God or Christianity because it's limited. Now, I can almost guarantee that any scientific claim that supposedly shows that God doesn't exist and that Christianity is false, it will come from historical science. So from now on, when I just use the word science, that's what we'll be referring to. Historical science is what we'll focus on today. So we've just seen, right, that in historical science, there are different ways to interpret the one set of facts. That leads us to ask the question, what controls the interpretations that a scientist makes? I mean, what controls that interpretation those scientists made that said, this tooth must have come from this ape, which must have been the ancestor of humans, rather than this tooth must have come from a pig? Right? Sometimes interpretations depend on the data that a scientist has. So the better the data, the better the interpretation. But a lot of the times it's not that simple. See, a lot of the time interpretations actually come back to the assumptions that the scientist starts with. And so second of all, secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity because of its assumption, its fundamental assumption. Right? In the world of science today, there is one assumption that is extremely prevalent. It's this assumption of naturalism or materialism. Now, naturalism can be a bit of a hard thing to define, but basically it's the worldview that says everything in the universe is the result of matter and energy and their routine interactions. Or even more simply, naturalism is the worldview that rejects anything supernatural. And so naturalism, by its very nature, it rejects the existence of God, or if God exists, he has absolutely nothing to do with reality. And naturalism is the underlying worldview in almost all of science today. And by the way, right, this is the reason why secular science seems so opposed to Christianity and the Bible. It's because secular science and Christianity, they're grounded in two fundamentally opposite worldviews. Right? Secular science is grounded in the worldview of naturalism, the rejection of anything supernatural, whereas Christianity is grounded in the belief of God, who obviously is supernatural, right? And more than this, Christianity is grounded in the belief of what the Bible teaches, which includes the history of the universe as recorded in the Bible. And that history teaches that on occasions, God has actually intervened in his creation in supernatural ways, and that primarily it's these supernatural interventions that have shaped the world we now observe. Right? So I'm talking about supernatural interventions like the miraculous creation of the universe, interventions like the fall of man and the curse placed on all creation, and supernatural interventions like the global catastrophic flood. See, as these interventions are primarily supernatural, secular science, with its underlying rejection of the supernatural, will never be able to perceive these events. And so, as long as secular science remains grounded in the worldview of naturalism, it will never be able to validate the history of the universe as recorded in the Bible, and so it will always seem opposed to that history. But the question is, what evidence does science give that the worldview of naturalism is actually correct? That there is no God and there is no supernatural? And the answer to that is absolutely none. Right? There is no scientific evidence backing up that worldview of naturalism because naturalism is not a scientific worldview. It's a purely philosophical worldview, right? God and the supernatural are excluded from the get-go as explanations before any science even takes place. And so what that means is that for those scientists that adopt this naturalistic worldview, it means their scientific interpretations will never end up with God or the supernatural. And no matter how bad their naturalistic interpretation of the data is, it must always stand if the only alternative is supernatural. There was this guy, Richard Lewontin. He was a former professor at Harvard University, a specialist in genetics, and a world leader in evolutionary biology. But he understood this, that there was absolutely no evidence to support his worldview of naturalism. And this is what he said. He said, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism or naturalism. It's not that science somehow compels us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Right, just to make it clear what he's saying that scientists have a commitment to naturalism that is not motivated by science, but purely by the pursuit to keep God out of science. Right? And that pursuit to keep God out of science, it's so strong that it leads to such a strict commitment to naturalism that it doesn't even matter how ridiculous the scientific claims of naturalism are. Naturalism must always stand, even though naturalism by its very nature is an assumption that's completely unsupported. Now let me take this one step further, particularly when it relates to this topic of the existence of God. The irony of the matter is this: despite God and the supernatural being excluded as explanations from the get-go based on a predetermined motivation, you still commonly hear the phrase that science has proven that God doesn't exist. Right? That's actually a completely nonsensical statement to make. Right? The naturalistic scientists can never say that their science has disproven the existence of God, because in actual fact, they excluded God as a potential explanation before they even started their science. Right? Their science, by their own definition, is powerless to even speak on the topic of God's existence. It would be like standing in a car yard and choosing a Ford over a Holden, and then as you drive out onto the road saying, see, I drive a Ford, I've proven that Holdens don't exist. Right? It doesn't make sense. So secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity because of its assumption, its fundamental assumption, the assumption of naturalism, which is just assumed. It's not proven, it's not shown to be true. So we've seen why secular science cannot disprove the existence of God and Christianity. Now let's look at why I believe secular science is actually inferior to belief in God and Christianity. Why Christianity is actually a better worldview for explaining reality. Okay, first of all, secular science is inferior to belief in God and Christianity because it's inconsistent. You know, modern science, it arose during the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe. And the culture in which it arose was predominantly a Christian culture, and certainly a monotheistic culture, right? A culture that believed in God. And from the early pioneering days of science, even up until about 100 or so years ago, the vast majority of the world's greatest scientists were all Christians. Right? I'm talking about guys like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, James Clerk Maxwell, Johannes Kepler, Lord Kelvin, Michael Faraday. Right? These absolute giants of modern science were all Christians, and actually their belief in Christianity and the God of the Bible was primary in their science. Right? These men actually used their faith in God to justify their science. See, science is all about observing and describing and explaining the laws of nature. And in the Christian worldview, God is a rational God. He's a God of order, not chaos. And that means He's created the world in an orderly and rational way, governed by laws. And so for the Christian, it makes sense that we can go out and conduct experiments and discover what those natural laws are. Right? For the Christian, it makes sense to do science. And that's exactly how these great Christian scientists throughout history thought, right? They had God, it gave them science. They believed there were natural laws to discover because they believed in a lawgiver. Right? These scientists were acting consistently with their thinking about how the world operates when they did science. But the funny thing is, in atheistic thinking, right, in naturalistic evolutionary thinking, there's actually no reason to believe that science should even be possible and work. Right? Because think about it. If you believe that your brain is the end product of a giant explosion and mindless, unaided, unguided natural processes over billions and billions of years, then you actually have no reason to trust your thoughts and senses. Because if all that's true, your brain is nothing but a big lump of tissue, right? Your thoughts are nothing but the firing of neurons, and your mind is nothing but blind chemistry and physics. And there's no reason why blind chemistry and physics should actually produce intelligent thoughts. There's no reason why blind chemistry and physics should produce trustworthy intellect and reason. And there's also no reason to expect that as your senses interact with the world around you, that they're actually giving you a reliable account of how the universe actually is. Right? So, in reality, atheistic science that subscribes to evolutionary naturalistic thinking, it's actually acting inconsistently with that thinking when it attempts to make reliable claims about how the universe works. Right? It's acting inconsistently with that thinking when it assumes its scientific knowledge is reliable. Well, think about it in this way. Right? Would you trust your computer if you knew it came about as a result of mindless natural processes? Right? If your computer formed after a tornado went through a junkyard, or even if your computer was put together by monkeys, some form of intelligence. Right? Of course not. If that's how your computer was built, you simply wouldn't trust that its internal wiring and its ability to process data would be reliable. The only reason you trust your computer is because you know it was designed by an engineer. It was built and constructed by intelligence. See, the Christian believes that their mind and their senses were put together by intelligence. Therefore, we can trust our thoughts and our senses, and this actually makes science possible. But the atheist does not believe they were put together by intelligence. Rather, they believe they came about as the result of unintelligence. And therefore, in that worldview, there's no reason why their thoughts shouldn't also be unintelligent. And if that's the case, science should not even be possible. But what do we know, right? We know science is possible. We know that it has demonstrated itself to work and actually uncover knowledge. Therefore, Christianity is superior to the secular worldview because it actually explains what we know to be true, the reliability of science. Secular science is inferior to belief in God and Christianity because it's inconsistent with itself. The Christian worldview is consistent both with the belief of the reliability of science, but also the demonstrated reliability of science. Now, secondly and finally, secular science is inferior to belief in God and Christianity because it's incomplete. You know, many people today, especially scientists, they think of God as the ancient Greeks viewed their gods. Right? The Greeks didn't understand how lightning and thunder worked, and so they invented the god Zeus to explain lightning and thunder. Right? Zeus was the god of lightning and thunder. And this type of god is called a god of the gaps, because the gaps in the scientific knowledge of the Greeks at that time were taken to be evidence or proof of Zeus's existence. And many people typically think of the Christian God in the same way, as someone that just explains that which we don't understand yet. And if God is simply just an explanation for that which we don't understand, well then of course you have to choose between God and science. Right? If you define God as someone that explains that which science hasn't explained yet, then of course you have to choose between the two. Because as soon as you discover a scientific explanation for that thing you didn't understand, well then God is no longer needed. And so in the same way that nobody believes in Zeus anymore because we understand how lightning and thunder work, well, God must gradually disappear as science progresses. But this is an incorrect view of God, right? The Christian God is not a God of the gaps like Zeus is. As John Lennox points out, Genesis 1:1 doesn't say, in the beginning, God created the things we don't understand yet. Right? It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created the whole show. And we see this vital contrast clearly when we understand the difference between fundamental and secondary explanations, right? See, almost all of science deals with secondary explanations. Why does water boil? What makes the sky blue? But a fundamental explanation sheds light on the question, why does any of that stuff even exist at all? Right? Why is there something rather than nothing? It's one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the 20th century, or any century for that matter, was that the universe actually had a beginning. Right? A beginning to time, a beginning to space, a beginning to matter and to energy. That means there was a point in reality in which none of those things existed. Right? Just think of absolutely nothing for a moment this morning. Right? We try and think of nothing and probably visualize some pitch black, empty region of space where there's no activity for ages and ages. But even that's wrong, right? Because you've still got space in that scenario. You've still got time running. Right? Nothing is actually very, very difficult to imagine. But if you can do your best right now to imagine absolutely nothing, right, ask yourself, if there was ever a point in which absolutely nothing existed, then what could there possibly be now? Apart from nothing, right? Nothing never ever produces something. Things always come from something. They always have a cause. For the universe to exist at all, it needs a fundamental explanation, an explanation as to why it exists in the first place. And guess what? Science cannot provide such an explanation because it only deals with time and space and matter and energy. And so before those things existed, science is powerless to speak. See, science only provides secondary explanations, therefore it's actually incomplete. The fundamental explanation of the universe, it must actually transcend or be outside of the universe. That means it must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful. And amazingly, right, before the idea of science was even conceived of, the Bible provides such a fundamental explanation. It says, in the beginning, God. Right? God caused the beginning of time itself, therefore he must be timeless. In the beginning, God created. Right? He created out of absolutely nothing, therefore he must be unimaginably powerful. It says in the beginning, God created the heavens. Right? He created space, therefore he must be spaceless. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, created earth or matter, therefore he must be immaterial. See, the Christian God is the perfect fundamental explanation for the universe. You know, most of us probably understand how a light globe works. Right? The light globe works by electricity passing through a filament, which heats that filament until it glows. Right? We get that. We understand that scientific explanation for the light globe. But because we understand that explanation, it doesn't then mean that Thomas Edison didn't invent the light globe, right? Of course not. Thomas Edison is the fundamental explanation for the light globe, the reason why the light globe even exists at all. The science of a glowing light globe, it's just a secondary explanation. And actually, that secondary explanation is meaningless without the fundamental explanation. We can't even talk of the science of a glowing light globe if the light globe doesn't exist in the first place. See, don't confuse understanding about the function of the universe with an explanation for the universe. Science can do an awesome job at explaining how the universe functions, but it cannot provide a fundamental explanation as to how the universe came to be. See, the universe requires a fundamental, transcendent, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful explanation for its existence. And the Christian worldview gives such an explanation. And so secular science is inferior to belief in God and Christianity because it's actually incomplete. It cannot provide the fundamental explanation that it needs. Christianity can. You know, as we look out into the world around us, right, we don't see a world governed by chaos and randomness. We see a world of order, of predictability, reflecting an orderly and rational God. Right? Our thoughts are not nonsensical, they're not unreliable, right? They're trustworthy, they're intelligent. We know this. This reflects our creation by intelligence. And no matter how well we understand the world around us through science, it still demands an underlying cause, something transcending the universe to bring it all into existence. It still demands the Creator God. See, Christianity is a far superior worldview because it actually explains reality. It makes sense. If you're not a Christian here today, right, you've just come along, you're investigating the claims of Christianity, then we're so glad that you've joined us. And I really hope you've seen this morning not only that science cannot disprove Christianity, but also that the Christian worldview is remarkably logical and is even necessary for a coherent picture of reality. But the thing is, right, just understanding that, or even just believing that intellectually, it's not enough. See, the Bible says that the Creator God loves His creation dearly, and that human beings are actually the pinnacle and His most prized creation. Right? We were created in God's image to enjoy this intimate relationship with God. That means that you are loved and you are valuable. Right? But the sin that entered the world and now permeates all people, it actually separates us from God. Right? We don't follow God and we don't honor God. And if we die in that separated state, the Bible says we will face eternal separation from God, separation from everything good and everything lovely. But the central message of the Bible is God's plan to get His prized creation back. Right? And the climax of this story is Jesus Christ, the Creator Himself, taking on the flesh of His creation and dying for His creation. Right? His death was an exchange for you. He took on all of our sin and in exchange offers us His perfection. And He took on our separation from God and in exchange offers us close intimacy with God for all of eternity. All of this is on offer for everybody simply through faith and repentance in Jesus Christ the Savior. I just want to urge you this morning to just consider this message. Right, it's amazing to me that one of the most common responses to the message of the Bible is actually apathy or indifference. Right? That's nice for someone else, but it's not for me. I don't really care. This response, right, it was also baffling to this guy, Blaise Pascal. He was a 17th century mathematician, physicist, and Christian philosopher. And what he did, he put himself in the shoes of the apathetic skeptic and sketched this amazingly vivid portrayal of what you're really saying when you take this apathetic, indifferent approach to such important matters like this. I just want to read out this for you as we come to a close this morning. This is what Pascal writes. I see the terrifying immensity of the universe which surrounds me and find myself limited to one corner of this vast expanse without knowing why I am set down here rather than elsewhere, nor why the brief period appointed for my life is assigned to me at this moment rather than another in all the eternity that has gone before and will come after me. On all sides I behold nothing but infinity, in which I am a mere atom, a mere passing shadow that returns no more. All I know is that I must soon die. But what I understand least of all is this very death which I cannot escape. As I know not whence I come, so I know not whither I go. I only know that on leaving this world, I fall forever into nothingness or into the hands of a wrathful God, without knowing to which of these two states I shall be everlastingly consigned. Such is my condition, full of weakness and uncertainty. And from all this I conclude that I ought to spend every day of my life without seeking to know my fate. I might perhaps be able to find some solution to my doubts, but I cannot be bothered to do so. I will not take one step towards its discovery. Do you see how foolish the response of apathy is? Right, if anything I've said to you this morning has made you think even just a little bit, yeah, that kind of makes sense, then you need to investigate. right? Because just if the message of the Bible is true, then apathy is a deadly response. It's a response that carries grave eternal consequences, right? Don't ask yourself, do I like this message? Don't even ask yourself, will believing this message change my lifestyle? The only question you should be asking is this message true? And if it is, right, if there's even the slightest chance that it could be true, then surely logic would drive you to strive with all that you have to investigate this message, right? The stakes are that high. If you need to find out more, then talk to someone. If you've got more questions, then talk to someone. If you've been searching for some time and it's actually time this morning to make a commitment to start following Jesus, then talk to someone about it.
One of the first questions that came through, or one of the questions that came through is, can you believe in evolution and Christianity?
Yeah, good question, and a very, very common question. And you'll actually find different answers to this question if you ask different people, right? So my belief is that, well, actually probably it's first to define what we mean by evolution, right? Evolution nowadays in the scientific community is actually just defined as change over time in a species or a population. And if you define it that way, then of course evolution is true, right? Because we do observe species changing. But what people normally mean when they talk about evolution is a process that's capable of taking non-life or very simple life and actually producing all the complexity of life we see on Earth today. And without getting into any of the science of that, is that belief compatible with the Bible? I would say no, and there's a number of reasons why. The biggest one is probably because if we see that evolution has produced life, and evolution has been going on for millions and millions of years before humans came on the scene, then what that actually means is that there's been millions and millions of years of death and disease and suffering, because that's what evolution requires to actually move forward. And all that stuff's been going on before Adam and Eve in the Bible actually sinned. And so you've got this picture of all this death, disease, and suffering before sin entered the world. But what we read in the Bible is actually that it was through Adam and Eve's sin that these things actually came into the world. And, that's the reason why Jesus came to die, because he came to actually take on the penalty for our sin, which was death. And so there's a lot of theological problems you run into if you assume that evolution's been going on for millions of years of Earth's history.
So just to drill into that, what's the fundamental difference between the evolutionary dating system and the creation dating system?
As in dating to get ages? Yeah, well, it's a bit of a difficult question because there are different types of dating systems. And so, like in geology, we've got a number of dating systems. The interesting thing is this idea of a very ancient old Earth was around long before any of these dating systems were around. And it came about purely because of this worldview of naturalism that we talked about. So naturalism in geology has led to this belief called uniformitarianism. All right, and what that belief says is that the processes we see going on Earth today are the same processes that have existed for all of Earth's history. And also that the rates of those processes have been essentially constant throughout Earth's history. So what that means is geologists back in the day, they would go and they would see a vast sequence of sedimentary rock, and they would see sediments being laid down by some river system or something very gradually, like milliliters per year. And so if you can extrapolate those rates back in time and you've got this vast sequence of rock, you would assume that rock took ages and ages to be laid down, right? Because you've got that assumption of uniformitarianism. Whereas if the Bible is true, that assumption is blatantly false, because the Bible talks about this catastrophic geological event called the flood, which would have deposited much of the Earth's sedimentary sequences very, very rapidly. So that's how this idea of an ancient Earth came about. And when you're talking about dating systems like carbon dating and radiometric dating, they're all built on similar premises and assumptions, that we can actually see processes going on in the present and extrapolate those processes back into the past, which again is assumption, and which again is something that a Christian would not hold to.
So someone put in this question. Are you familiar with the Monument Valley in Arizona?
Yeah.
The question is, what's the most plausible explanation for an unusual structure like that?
Yeah, sure. And
Do you want to just describe the Monument
yeah,
Valley?
probably even a better one to describe is Uluru, like Ayers Rock. We're probably all familiar with that. And it's really puzzling how you get these vast flat landscapes of nothing, and then these giant rocks literally sticking up out of the ground. And actually, flood geology provides a far better explanation as to how you can get these things. So uniformitarian geology, or secular geology, it talks about erosion rates acting slowly throughout eons of time. And if that's true, basically, you wouldn't expect to get these big structures because you expect them to erode with the landscape. Even if the rocks are of different hardness, which affects erosion, over enough time, the effects will kind of even out because geology doesn't like things sticking out, doesn't like sharp contacts, it likes to erode flat. Whereas geology, if you're looking at the global flood, right, and that explanation, a lot of Christian geologists, they see the erosion from that flood happening in two stages. So initially you have basically like a sheet wash phase, which washes flat in massive areas of water and basically erodes landscapes essentially flat. And then after that, you see erosion in channels and canals, so forming big canyons and things like that. And so if you take that explanation, basically what you have is you should see out and about, you should see flat landscapes truncated by big valleys and canals. And when those things erode further and further in, you can end up with structures like Uluru or Monument Valley. And those real flat structures with steep sides, it's actually very difficult to explain those with uniformitarian geology.
Okay, here's a personal one for you. How have you found being a Christian scientist in a secular environment, and workplace so far? How have you found that you've been received and like debates of around ideas and things like that?
It's funny, like, especially the creationist belief is something you actually have to keep pretty quiet in, university institutions because there's a lot of documented, like persecution that goes on towards people, and people that hold those beliefs have, lost jobs and haven't been able to further their careers and things like that. But definitely with, close and trusted friends, I've expressed my beliefs, and I've actually found a lot of them are actually respectful of those kind of beliefs. But also, I guess this is why I addressed that response of apathy at the end, because that's actually what I've found is the most common response of people is apathy, like it doesn't really matter, who cares? Whereas there's this perception that it's, most people have a very aggressive response to those beliefs, and that's not really something that I've found. It's more of like, yeah, who really cares? It doesn't matter. So that's probably more of the challenge, actually addressing, those responses than like an aggressive response. How could you possibly believe things like that? So probably easier in some ways to respond to those, but harder in other ways as well. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Here's a question. You said that it's or nonsensical or for naturalists to exclude the possibility of believing in God. Does this mean you've considered what it would take for you to disbelieve in God? What would need to happen for you to disbelieve in God? Have you ever thought of that?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Yeah. And it's hard to imagine because I guess if I could, think of something, maybe I would have. No, I don't know. Yeah, it is tough. And I guess when we're talking about, I've talked about the limitations of scientific evidence and the fact that scientific interpretations stem from assumptions. And so having known that, I don't think there would be much scientific evidence that could really shake that if you believe those first two premises that I talked about. And so, yeah, that's a really, really tough question to ask, and I honestly don't know the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. When that question came through, the first thing I thought of was after the resurrection, where Jesus actually appeared to many people who had seen him before, so knew he was real. It said that many believed, but some doubted. And so there's actually, even in the record, the biblical record, it actually says that some doubted, even though Jesus was standing right there in front of them. And so perhaps...
Yeah, because we can always come up with another explanation. Like, I've heard this question asked to atheists before. It's uncommon to ask Christians, that's why it's a bit like, but I've heard this asked to atheists, and, someone would say, if God wrote up in the sky in stars, I exist or something like that, then I'd believe. But even then they would say, but actually, I could probably explain that as just some hallucination that I'm having. So there's always another explanation, and this just shows how powerful our predetermined ideas are at shaping our beliefs, that evidence actually has very little power for a lot of people. And this is true in the Bible. The Bible talks about, it's not just evidence that makes people believe, it's actually a spiritual work. But even science has confirmed that. When we make big decisions, we don't make them with our intellectual, logical side of our heads. We often make them with the emotional sides of our heads.